In 1868, three men walked into a small workshop in Norwich, Connecticut, with nothing but a handful of tools, a stack of unpaid bills, and a dream that would eventually arm more working-class Americans than almost any other company in history. Charles Hopkins, Charles Allen, and Horace Briggs shook hands, signed papers, and founded what would become one of the most fascinating, most forgotten firearms empires ever built on American soil. At their peak, Hopkins and Allen were producing revolvers so fast that their factory floors never cooled. They had contracts with foreign governments, partnerships with department stores, and a catalog thicker than a Bible. Then, in 1917, it all vanished. Not slowly, not gracefully. Gone, like smoke through a cracked window, leaving behind nothing but rusty steel, faded patent papers, and 25 revolvers that most Americans have never even heard of. Stay with me to the end, because number one on this list is a revolver that was actually banned in 3 states before most people even knew it existed, and the story of why it was banned will completely change how you think about gun control in early 20th century America. And if you are new here, subscribe right now, because every week we dig up the firearms history that the textbooks refuse to print. Number 25 is where we have to start, because it is the revolver that almost never was. The Hopkins and Allen XL number 1 was chambered in .22 short and built in 1876, just 8 years after the company opened its doors. It was a tiny pocket revolver, 7 shots, a bird's head grip that fit neatly into a working man's vest pocket, and a price tag that made it accessible to people who had never owned a gun in their lives. Factory workers bought them. Immigrants fresh off the boat bought them. Farmers tucked them into their overalls before walking their fence lines at night. The XL number 1 was not elegant. It was not refined. It was honest steel at an honest price, and that was exactly what Hopkins and Allen had set out to build. What made it remarkable was not its power, but its reach. By the late 1870s, Hopkins and Allen were selling these through hardware stores, dry goods stores, and mail-order catalogs from coast to coast. They were democratizing self-defense in a country that was still figuring out what that phrase even meant. Number 24 is a revolver that caused genuine confusion in the marketplace, and that confusion was entirely intentional. The Hopkins and Allen XL number 5 was chambered in .38 S&W, and its silhouette was so deliberately close to Smith & Wesson's competing models that gun dealers in the 1880s reported customers regularly picking up the Hopkins and Allen, thinking they had grabbed a Smith. Hopkins and Allen were not counterfeiting. Everything was clearly marked. But they understood something that modern brand consultants charge millions to explain. If you look like the premium product but cost half as much, you will sell twice as many. The XL number 5 retailed for around $3 at a time, when a Smith & Wesson in the same caliber cost closer to $7 or $8. For a factory worker making $9 a week, that difference was a week's groceries. Hopkins and Allen won those customers every single time, and Smith & Wesson's lawyers were furious about it for most of the 1880s. Number 23 is a revolver that started a war, at least inside Hopkins and Allen's own engineering department. The Dictator model, introduced around 1877, was chambered in .32 rimfire and featured a side-loading gate that some engineers believed was a direct infringement on existing patents. The internal arguments were fierce. One faction wanted to redesign the gate entirely. Another faction argued the design was different enough to survive any legal challenge. A third faction, apparently, just wanted to keep making guns and let the lawyers sort it out later. The third faction won. The Dictator went into production, the patent challenges came, Hopkins and Allen survived them all, and the revolver sold steadily through the early 1880s. It was never a huge seller, but it established something important. Hopkins and Allen were willing to fight for a design they believed in, and they were not afraid of the legal system that larger companies use to bully smaller competitors. Number 22 on this list is the first revolver that Hopkins and Allen produced under a house brand, and house brands were something this company would become masters of. The Merwin, Hulbert & Company revolvers that appeared in the late 1870s were manufactured entirely by Hopkins and Allen, but sold under the Merwin-Hulbert name. Merwin-Hulbert were distributors, not manufacturers, and they needed a factory partner who could produce quality revolvers at volume and price. Hopkins and Allen fit perfectly. The arrangement was profitable for both sides, but it also revealed something about Hopkins and Allen's business model that would define them for the next 4 decades. They were perfectly comfortable being the invisible engine behind someone else's brand. They did not need their name on the barrel to make money. They just needed to keep the machines running. Number 21 was a revolver built for a market that most American gun companies completely ignored in the 1880s. The Hopkins and Allen ladies model, sometimes cataloged simply as the ladies' safety revolver, was chambered in a .32 S&W and designed specifically for female buyers. It had a shorter grip frame, lighter mainspring tension, and a folding hammer that made it safer to carry in a purse or a skirt pocket without risking an accidental discharge from fabric snagging on the hammer spur. This was not a novelty item. Hopkins and Allen genuinely understood that women in the 1880s lived with real threats: traveling salesmen, isolated homesteads, urban boarding houses where a woman alone had very little recourse if something went wrong at 2 in the morning. The ladies' model sold well enough to remain in the catalog for over a decade, which in the revolving door world of late Victorian gun manufacturing was as close to a ringing endorsement as the market could give. Number 20 is a revolver that found its most enthusiastic market almost by accident. The Hopkins and Allen XL Double Action No. 3, introduced in the early 1880s, was designed as a general service revolver for the civilian market. What nobody planned was that it would become enormously popular with railroad workers across the American West. The railroads were dangerous places in the 1880s. Train robberies were not a myth. Workers on remote construction crews lived in tent camps far from any law enforcement, and a cheap, reliable double-action revolver was something a lot of them were actively looking for. The XL Double Action No. 3 was exactly cheap enough and exactly reliable enough to fill that need. Nobody from Hopkins and Allen ever set foot in a railroad camp to pitch the revolver. Word just spread along the lines, from crew to crew, until orders were coming in from hardware stores in towns that Hopkins and Allen had never specifically targeted. If you have made it this far, drop a comment below telling me which of these revolvers surprised you most. We have got 19 more to go, and they only get stranger from here. Number 19 is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because this is the first Hopkins and Allen revolver that was exported in significant numbers. The Belgian contract revolvers of 1882 were standard XL No. 4 frames remarked for export and chambered in a metric cartridge to meet Belgian military specifications. Hopkins and Allen won the contract partly on price, and partly because they had quietly built relationships with European arms dealers throughout the late 1870s. The Belgian guns were never glamorous, but they demonstrated something crucial. Hopkins and Allen could meet international military standards, deliver on time, and undercut European competitors on price. That combination would matter enormously in the years ahead, particularly as South American governments started shopping for affordable sidearms to equip rapidly expanding military forces. Number 18 is a revolver that almost nobody associates with Hopkins and Allen because it was sold entirely under a different name. The Forehand and Wadsworth line of revolvers manufactured between 1871 and 1890 included several models that rolled off the Hopkins and Allen factory floor in Norwich. Forehand and Wadsworth were a respected Springfield, Massachusetts firm with a good reputation and a loyal customer base. But their manufacturing capacity had limits. Hopkins and Allen supplied them with complete revolvers, sometimes with minor variations in finish or grip style to make the products feel slightly distinct. The arrangement was an open secret in the American arms trade, but was never publicly acknowledged by either company. When Forehand and Wadsworth eventually closed in 1890, Hopkins and Allen quietly absorbed some of their tooling and continued producing revolvers in the same calibers for their own catalog. Number 17 is the revolver that made Hopkins and Allen genuinely dangerous competitors to Smith & Wesson in the medium caliber market. The safety police model, introduced in the late 1880s, was chambered in .32 S&W and featured a grip safety that automatically blocked the trigger unless the shooter's hand was properly positioned on the grip frame. This was sophisticated engineering. Grip safeties were not new in the 1880s, but integrating one cleanly into a small, inexpensive double-action revolver without making the trigger pull feel like pulling a rope through wet sand was genuinely difficult. Hopkins and Allen's engineers solved it elegantly. The safety police retailed for around $4 and was actively marketed to police departments that wanted an affordable service revolver with some protection against accidental discharge. A number of small municipal departments bought them. The design was good enough that Smith & Wesson paid close attention to it, which was the most sincere form of flattery available in the 19th century arms industry. Number 16 is a revolver built at the exact moment when Hopkins and Allen's business strategy shifted permanently. In 1896, Sears, Roebuck and Company published their famous catalog with a full page dedicated to Hopkins and Allen revolvers, priced from $1.35 to $2.98. The revolver they featured most prominently was the Hopkins and Allen XL Double Action, and they sold it under the generic name Defender to American buyers who may not have known or cared who actually made it. The Sears relationship changed everything. Suddenly, Hopkins and Allen were not just supplying hardware stores and regional distributors. They were supplying the largest retail operation in America, reaching customers in every state, every county, every rural mailbox. Production numbers jumped. The factory ran longer shifts, and Hopkins and Allen became, almost overnight, the largest supplier of inexpensive revolvers to the American mass market, a position they would hold for the next 15 years. Number 15 is a revolver that only exists because of a lawsuit. The Hopkins and Allen number 6 appeared in 1897 after a patent dispute with Iver Johnson forced the company to redesign its cylinder release mechanism. Rather than simply filing for a new patent and moving on, the engineering team used the forced redesign as an opportunity to rebuild the entire trigger group from scratch. The resulting mechanism was smoother, more reliable, and cheaper to manufacture than what it replaced. The lawsuit cost Hopkins and Allen several $1,000s in settlement fees. The redesign it forced saved them significantly more than that over the following decade. This was one of the recurring patterns in Hopkins and Allen's history: external pressure producing internal improvement, because the company had the engineering talent to turn problems into opportunities when management gave them the latitude to work. Number 14 is a revolver that tells you exactly how Hopkins and Allen thought about brand extension. The Forehand Model 1901, introduced just after they absorbed what remained of the Forehand Arms Company, was chambered in R32 S&W long and marketed specifically to buyers who associated the Forehand name with quality. Hopkins and Allen understood that brand loyalty was an asset worth purchasing, and when Forehand and Wadsworth's successor firm ran into financial trouble, Hopkins and Allen moved quickly. They bought the rights, incorporated the name into their catalog, and used it to capture a slightly more upscale segment of the market without having to change a single thing about their manufacturing process. The Forehand Model 1901 was, mechanically, pure Hopkins and Allen. The name on the grip was the only thing that cost extra. Subscribe right now if you want to see our upcoming video on the 5 most valuable Hopkins and Allen revolvers at auction in 2024 and what they sold for, because the numbers will genuinely shock you. Number 13 is a revolver that went to war, though not with American soldiers. The Hopkins and Allen Army Model revolver, chambered in .38 caliber and produced around 1900, was sold in moderate quantities to several Central American governments during the period of intense political instability that followed the Spanish-American War. These governments needed serviceable sidearms quickly and cheaply, and Hopkins and Allen could provide both. The Army model was not a masterpiece. The metallurgy was adequate rather than excellent, the finish was workmanlike rather than fine, and the trigger pull would never be confused with a target pistol. But it worked consistently enough in field conditions that the governments who bought it were satisfied, and several reordered. In the archives of at least 2 Central American militaries, Hopkins and Allen revolvers appear on equipment lists dated as late as 1915. Number 12 is the Hopkins and Allen that you are most likely to find at a gun show today, and it is probably the most misunderstood revolver in their catalog. The XL Double Action Number 4, produced in large numbers between 1893 and 1915, was so widely distributed through so many different retail channels under so many different names that collectors regularly buy them without realizing what they actually have. Versions of this revolver were sold as the Ranger, the Imperial, the Globe, the Liberty, and at least 3 other names that have been documented in surviving catalog records. The mechanics were identical across all variations. Only the markings changed. This practice infuriated some contemporaries who felt it was deceptive, but Hopkins and Allen's position was straightforward. The retailer bought the gun, the retailer put their name on it, and the gun was the same quality regardless of what the barrel said. They were not wrong exactly, but they were also making it very difficult for anyone to understand just how dominant they actually were in the American revolver market. Number 11 is a revolver that represented Hopkins and Allen's only serious attempt to move up market. The new model Army revolver of 1906, chambered in .44 caliber, featured a higher quality barrel steel, improved timing on the cylinder, and a hand-fitted trigger group that gave it a noticeably smoother action than anything else in the Hopkins and Allen catalog. It cost significantly more than their standard offerings, and was marketed explicitly to buyers who wanted quality at a reasonable price, rather than simply the lowest price available. It sold poorly. Hopkins and Allen's reputation was so firmly established in the budget segment that customers who wanted quality went to Colt or Smith & Wesson, and customers who wanted budget went to Hopkins and Allen's cheaper lines. The new model Army was caught in the middle, not quite premium enough to attract the quality buyer, and too expensive to attract the price buyer. It was discontinued after 3 years, and Hopkins and Allen never seriously tried to move upmarket again. Number 10 is a revolver that changed American firearms law, though not in the way its makers intended. The Hopkins and Allen vest pocket model, a tiny, .22 short 5-shot revolver small enough to disappear entirely in a closed fist, became a flashpoint in the early gun control debates of the 1900s. Reform advocates in New York, New Jersey, and Illinois began targeting what they called suicide specials, a derogatory term for inexpensive small-caliber revolvers they claimed were primarily used for violent crime, rather than legitimate self-defense. The Hopkins and Allen vest pocket model was specifically named in legislative debates in at least 2 states. The Sullivan Law in New York, passed in 1911, dramatically restricted who could carry a concealed handgun, and while it was not aimed exclusively at Hopkins and Allen products, it devastated the market for exactly the kind of inexpensive pocket revolvers that Hopkins and Allen specialized in. Sales in the northeastern urban markets collapsed almost immediately. Number 9 is a revolver that Hopkins and Allen built under contract for a company most gun historians never associate with them. The Meriden Firearms Company revolvers sold between 1905 and 1915 were manufactured at the Hopkins and Allen factory in Norwich. Meriden Firearms was effectively a brand created by Sears to give their firearms offerings the appearance of coming from a dedicated arms manufacturer rather than a general retailer, and Hopkins and Allen were the factory behind the curtain. The relationship was profitable and quiet, and it lasted until Sears began winding down their firearms business in response to exactly the same regulatory pressure that was squeezing Hopkins and Allen's direct sales. When Meriden Firearms was dissolved in 1915, Hopkins and Allen lost one of their largest single accounts almost overnight. Number 8 is where you have to understand what was happening to Hopkins and Allen's world in the years between 1910 and 1917. The gun industry was changing in ways that hit budget manufacturers hardest. Raw material costs were rising, labor was organizing, and wages were going up. The regulatory environment was tightening in key urban markets. Colt and Smith & Wesson were investing in semi-automatic pistol technology that made traditional double-action revolvers look increasingly old-fashioned. Hopkins and Allen had the engineering talent to adapt, but adapting required capital investment, and the company's financial structure had never been built for large capital investment. They had built a business on running lean, on keeping overhead low, on squeezing every cent of profit from volume production. That model was running out of room. The Hopkins and Allen automatic hammerless revolver of 1905, which is number 8 on our list, was their attempt to answer the hammerless trend that Smith & Wesson and Iver Johnson had pioneered. Hammerless was actually a misnomer. The hammer was present but fully enclosed within the grip frame, invisible and inaccessible from the outside, which made the revolver snag-free when drawn from a pocket. It also made the revolver double-action only, since there was no way to cock the hammer manually. Hopkins and Allen executed the design competently. The trigger pull was heavy, as double-action only triggers always are, but the mechanism was reliable, and the price was exactly where Hopkins and Allen needed it to be to compete with the Iver Johnson equivalent. It sold reasonably well until the regulatory environment and the Sears contract loss combined to gut the market beneath it. Number 7 is a revolver that collectors describe with the reverence usually reserved for much more expensive guns. The Hopkins & Allen XL Navy, chambered in 38 S&W and featuring a nickel finish and pearl-style grip panels, was the most visually elegant thing the company ever produced. It was never a top seller. It was never intended to be. It existed as a catalog item that let Hopkins & Allen say they offered a presentation-grade revolver, something a man might buy as a gift or carry as a dress sidearm, rather than a working tool. The XL Navy is rare today precisely because it was never mass-produced. It shows up at auction perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, and when it does, it regularly sells for prices that would astonish anyone who thought of Hopkins & Allen as purely a budget manufacturer. The nickel finish on surviving examples is often still bright, evidence that whatever Hopkins & Allen did with their plating process on the XL Navy, they did it right. Drop a comment below telling me which Hopkins & Allen revolver you would most want in your collection, if you found one tomorrow. The answers in the comments on videos like this one are always fascinating. Number 6 is a revolver that nobody planned to become historically significant, but which ended up being one of the last things Hopkins & Allen ever made. The double-action number 6 of 1915 was a standard catalog offering in 32 S&W long, indistinguishable in most respects from half a dozen other revolvers Hopkins & Allen had made in the previous decade. What makes it historically interesting is timing. The double-action No. and 6 was in production when World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, and it remained in production as American arms companies began receiving enormous European military contracts that required retooling to larger calibers and military specifications. Hopkins & Allen was not equipped to pivot to military production. They lacked the capital, the tooling, and the floor space. While Colt and Smith & Wesson retooled their factories to produce 455 Webley revolvers for British forces, and eventually 45 ACP pistols for American forces, Hopkins & Allen kept making inexpensive 32 caliber revolvers for a civilian market that was rapidly losing interest. Number 5 is a revolver that exists at the intersection of tragedy and commerce. In 1914, Hopkins & Allen was acquired by Marlin Firearms, a well-capitalized New Haven company that had built its reputation on lever-action rifles. Marlin saw potential in Hopkins & Allen's factory space, machinery, and workforce, but they had no real commitment to the Hopkins & Allen revolver line. When the war contracts began flowing and Marlin started retooling the Norwich facility for military rifle production, the revolver business was quietly set aside. The workers who had spent decades perfecting the mechanisms of small double-action revolvers found themselves making rifle components instead. The institutional knowledge accumulated over 46 years of revolver manufacturing began to disperse as workers retired, moved on, or were reassigned to work they had never done before. Number 4 is a revolver whose story is really a story about what we lose when manufacturing knowledge disappears. The process of fitting a Hopkins & Allen cylinder to its frame was not written down in any surviving document. It was passed from experienced workers to apprentices on the factory floor, a physical knowledge stored in fingertips and muscle memory rather than on paper. When the Norwich factory converted to rifle production in 1914 and 1915, those fitting skills walked out the door with the workers who possessed them and were never systematically preserved. Today, gunsmiths who attempt to restore Hopkins & Allen revolvers to firing condition routinely report that the cylinder-to-frame fit requires a level of hand-fitting judgment that cannot be replicated from any existing documentation. You simply have to know what right feels like, and the people who knew are gone. Number 3 is a revolver that was designed but never fully produced, and its existence was unknown until a patent application surfaced in a Connecticut archive in 1978. The Hopkins & Allen semi-automatic revolver patent of 1912 described a mechanism that would use gas pressure from a fired cartridge to partially rotate the cylinder and cock the hammer for the next shot, reducing trigger pull weight in double-action fire. It was innovative. It was also deeply impractical given Hopkins & Allen's manufacturing capabilities and financial situation in 1912, and the design never made it beyond prototype stage. The patent drawing shows a revolver that looks almost identical to the standard double-action number 4 externally. with the gas-operated mechanism entirely internal. Whether any physical prototype was ever built remains unknown. If one exists, it has never been documented in any public collection. Number 2 is a revolver that represents the most poignant chapter in Hopkins and Allen's history, because it was the last revolver ever produced under the Hopkins and Allen name. In late 1916 and early 1917, as Marlin completed the conversion of the Norwich facility to military rifle production, a small number of revolvers were assembled from remaining parts inventory and shipped to distributors to fulfill outstanding orders. These last revolvers have no distinguishing mark that identifies them as final production pieces. They look identical to any other late Hopkins and Allen product, but researchers who have traced serial number sequences and distributor records believe that somewhere between 200 and 400 revolvers were completed in those final months, making them among the rarest Hopkins and Allen specimens that can be authenticated. Some of them are certainly in collections today, unrecognized by their owners as survivors of a company's last breath. Now, we arrive at number 1. And I told you at the beginning that this was a revolver that was banned in 3 states, and I need to explain exactly what happened and why it matters so much more than most people realize. The Hopkins and Allen vest pocket hammerless was a .32 caliber double-action revolver with an enclosed hammer, a 2-inch barrel, and a total length of just under 5 inches. It weighed less than 14 ounces. It could fire 5 rounds of .32 S&W and be slipped back into a coat pocket before most people in a room realized what had happened. It retailed for $1.75 through Sears in 1910 and was advertised with the phrase, "always ready for instant use." In 1910, that was a selling point. By 1912, exactly that phrase was being read into the legislative record in New York, Illinois, and New Jersey, as legislators debated what one reform advocate called the industrialization of murder. The vest pocket hammerless was not singled out because it was uniquely dangerous. It was singled out because it was uniquely accessible. Any person, regardless of criminal history, mental state, or intent, could order one through the mail for less than $2, have it delivered to their home, and carry it loaded and concealed without breaking any law in most states. The reformers who targeted it understood, correctly, that the question of who gets to own a firearm is not separable from the question of how easy it is to get one. The manufacturers, Hopkins and Allen included, argued that they were simply meeting a demand that existed and that the government had no business deciding who was trustworthy enough to own a $1.75 revolver. Both sides were making arguments we still make today, in essentially the same terms, over a century later. The vest pocket hammerless was discontinued not because of direct legislation banning its manufacture, but because the regulatory environment it had helped create made the economics of producing it unworkable. The market for a $1.75 pocket revolver collapses when the states where most of your customers live require a permit to carry one, and when the largest single retail outlet for that revolver, Sears, decides the political and legal risk is no longer worth the margin. Hopkins and Allen did not fight those forces. They could not. They had neither the capital nor the political connections to mount a serious defense, and by 1914, it was already too late. The revolver that had armed a generation of working-class Americans, the revolver that reformers called a tool of murder and its buyers called a tool of survival, was simply discontinued. The machines that made it were retooled. The workers who assembled it moved on. And Hopkins and Allen, the company that had spent 46 years proving that self-defense was not a luxury reserved for people who could afford a Colt, disappeared into a history that most Americans have never bothered to read. What stays with me about Hopkins and Allen is not the revolvers themselves, impressive as they are as mechanical objects. What stays with me is what they represented in their moment, the belief that ordinary people deserved the same access to security that wealthy people took for granted, and the equally powerful belief, on the other side, that some things are too dangerous to be made so easy. That argument did not end in 1917. It did not end with Hopkins and Allen's last revolver rolling off a Norwich assembly line and being packed into a crate for a distributor who would never reorder. It is the same argument happening right now, in state houses and courtrooms and kitchen tables across America, and it has been happening without interruption since the very first Hopkins and Allen XL No. 1 went into a working man's vest pocket in 1876. If this video made you think about any of that differently, I want to know about it in the comments below. Tell me which revolver surprised you most. Tell me if you own one. And tell me whether you think Hopkins and Allen's story is a tragedy or just business. I will be reading every single comment. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it now, because the story of American firearms history is far stranger and far more human than anyone who has never looked closely at it could possibly imagine.